Hey everyone, welcome back. Are you ready to go on another deep dive with me? Today, we're going to be exploring the world of podcasting.
Ooh, exciting.
It is. And get this, we're going to be looking at it through the lens of this academic chapter that calls podcasting a hybrid cultural form.
Interesting.
So we'll be kind of looking at podcasting's relationship with other media, particularly radio, and seeing how it fits into this whole media landscape.
I'm intrigued already.
Me too. And,
Yeah.
it's something we all engage with, right? Podcasts are everywhere these days.
They really are.
But yeah, I'm curious to see how this deep dive unpacks that hybridity. Like, is podcasting just radio 2.0 or is it something totally new?
Yeah, that's the big question, isn't it?
It is.
Yeah.
And, I think a lot of people have that thought.
Right?
Is it just radio that's been moved online?
Yeah.
Or, are there some really fundamentally different things going on here?
Yeah, I think our source material actually touches on that debate pretty early on.
Oh, does it?
Yeah. There's a whole discussion in media studies about whether podcasting is a continuation of radio or a distinct medium in its own right.
Interesting. So there's no real consensus.
Not really. I mean, some scholars like Lacey, Bottomley, and Quinar, they tend to focus on the continuities between radio and podcasting.
Okay.
But then you have others like Spinelli and Dan, who
Yeah.
are sound and digital media scholars, who believe that podcasting really deserves its own separate category.
Because it is so unique.
Exactly.
Interesting. So two very distinct camps.
Yeah, and it's interesting because, they each bring up valid points,
Right.
but this chapter actually takes kind of a third perspective.
Oh.
It argues that podcasting is best understood as a hybrid form.
Ah, okay. A little bit of both.
Yeah, it's not about just picking one side or the other. It's about recognizing how podcasting borrows from radio, but also does its own thing.
I like that.
And to understand that hybrid idea, the author introduces this concept of remediation.
Remediation.
Yeah, it's basically this idea. It was coined by Bolter and Grusing,
Okay.
and they're saying that new media often repurpose and reshape elements of older media.
Okay.
You can even think about it like early films, right?
Yeah.
They drew a lot of inspiration from theater before finding their own unique style as a medium.
Ah, that makes sense. So it's sort of like they're taking what worked in the past
Right.
and then adapting it, innovating upon it.
Exactly.
Okay, so how does this remediation play out with podcasting?
So the author argues that podcasting remediates radio on 3 different levels.
Okay.
The production ecosystem,
Okay.
genres and aesthetics, and then listening practices.
Okay, so it's not just about the content itself.
Right. It's about the whole experience.
It's about everything around it as well.
Exactly.
Okay, so let's break those down a little bit. Starting with production, how is that similar or different between radio and podcasting?
Okay, so if you think about the early days of both radio and podcasting,
Yeah.
they were both kind of like a Wild West, right? A lot of amateurs, a lot of independent creators.
About a passion, probably.
Yeah, it was all very DIY, a lot of passion, a lot of experimentation.
Yeah.
But as both mediums grew, you start to see the similar shift happen
Towards what?
towards commercialization.
Okay.
Things start to become more professionalized. You see power concentrating in the hands of bigger corporations.
It's like kind of, I don't know if selling out is the right word, but moving more towards the mainstream. And
Yeah, kind of like a mainstreaming, yeah.
Yeah.
And it's interesting because that shift in podcasting that we're seeing now towards big companies,
Yeah.
it kind of mirrors what happened with radio decades ago.
Oh, wow.
It's like this historical pattern repeating itself.
That's fascinating.
You could even compare it to like the Radio Act of 1927,
Okay.
which is what led to broadcasting becoming a commodity.
So it's like history is rhyming a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. So what are some of the big players now in podcasting?
Oh, you got your Spotify, your Audible. Apple's a huge player.
Yeah, of course.
Entercom, and then you have some traditional media companies getting involved as well.
Oh, like I'm thinking of like the New York Times or like NPR.
Exactly.
They have a huge podcasting arm.
Yeah, they're either buying up existing podcast networks or they're creating their own.
Right.
And you even have like international companies.
Oh, really?
The Spanish media giant Prisa,
Okay.
they launched their Podium podcast platform back in 2016.
Wow, I didn't even know that.
It's a global phenomenon.
It really is.
Yeah.
So what does all this mean for us
Mhm.
as like everyday podcast listeners?
Well, that's a great question. It kind of raises this question about the future of podcasting.
Okay.
Will it remain this diverse, independent space?
Yeah.
Or will it become more and more controlled by just a handful of powerful players, like what we saw happen with radio?
That's a great question. It makes you think about what kind of podcasting world we want to see, right?
Yeah, exactly. What kind of future are we creating for this medium?
Well, let's move on to that second level of radio remediation that you were talking about, genre and style. What's going on there?
Okay, so this is where it gets really interesting. Podcasting has actually revived certain radio genres
Oh, really?
that were kind of, losing popularity,
Okay.
like radio dramas,
Wow.
documentaries, serial fiction.
Yeah.
All these have found new life in the podcasting world.
I can totally see that. Like shows like Welcome to Night Vale or Hardcore History.
Exactly. Those are great examples.
Or like Serial, right? That was huge.
Yeah, it really captivated audiences.
Why do you think these genres have been so successful in podcasting?
Well, I think a key factor is how we listen to podcasts.
Oh,
It's
okay.
different from radio, right?
Yeah.
Radio often fades into the background.
It's like background noise while you're doing other things.
Exactly. But podcasts, they kind of demand your attention.
Yeah.
They encourage what the author calls foreground listening.
Foreground listening. Okay, what does that mean?
It means you're actively engaged with the content.
Oh, okay.
You're not just passively letting it wash over you.
That's interesting because I find like when I listen to a podcast, I'm really focused on it.
Right.
Way more than I ever am with the radio.
Exactly. It's a different level of engagement.
Yeah, that makes sense. So it's not just about the content itself, it's about how we consume it.
Exactly.
And that kind of leads us into that third level of radio remediation,
Yeah.
which is all about those listening practices themselves.
Yeah. Think back to like the early days of radio,
Yeah.
Families gathered around the radio listening to their favorite shows together.
Oh, yeah, those classic images.
It was a very social experience.
Yeah.
And podcasting has kind of brought back that collective listening, but in a new way.
Oh, how so?
Well, it's not necessarily families in living rooms anymore,
Right.
but we have online communities, podcast festivals,
Oh, yeah.
where listeners connect with each other
That's true. You're right.
over their shared love of a particular show or just audio in general.
Yeah.
It's like podcasting has created its own virtual listening circles.
I love that. And social media plays a huge role in that too, right?
Oh, absolutely.
Like people are always sharing podcast recommendations, having discussions online.
It's like this whole ecosystem built around podcasting.
It really is.
Yeah.
But you mentioned intimacy earlier in terms of listening practices.
Right.
What did you mean by that?
Well, think about how you usually listen to podcasts,
Yeah.
often through headphones, right?
True.
Creates a sense of one-on-one connection with the host.
Yeah.
You're not just part of a massive audience. It's much more personal.
Oh, that's a good point. It feels very personal.
Yeah.
Like the host is talking directly to you, sharing their thoughts and experiences.
It's almost like a conversation,
Yeah,
which is different from that one-to-many dynamic of traditional radio.
That's a good distinction. Okay, so we've got this like intimacy on the one hand and then this kind of burgeoning community aspect on the other.
Exactly. It's like this interesting tension. And then we also need to talk about how podcasting, like radio, can transcend borders.
Okay.
It's a transnational medium.
What do you mean by that?
Well, just like shortwave radio connected people across continents back in the day,
Yeah.
podcasts can connect listeners from all over the world.
Oh, that's true. You can listen to a podcast from like anywhere.
Exactly.
Wow. So we're like building a global community of audio enthusiasts.
In a way, yeah.
That's pretty cool.
But there are some, potential downsides to this as well.
Well, like what?
Well, the author does mention some concerns about cultural dominance.
Oh, okay.
Like, for example, in a lot of European countries,
Yeah.
a huge portion of the most popular podcasts come from the U.S.
Oh, interesting.
So it kind of raises this question of, could American podcasts overshadow local voices and stories?
So it's like a potential for homogenization,
Yeah, potentially.
where certain voices become dominant and others get drowned out.
Right. It's something to be mindful of.
Yeah, that's a good point. Okay, so we've covered those three ways. Podcasting takes cues from radio, production, genre, and listening practices.
Right.
It's really interesting how it kind of borrows from that older medium, but also creates something new.
Yeah, and we're just scratching the surface here.
Oh, are we?
Yeah, because remember, podcasting isn't just about rehashing radio.
Yeah.
It draws inspiration from a much wider range of media, which is what makes it so unique.
Okay, I am very intrigued. Tell me more.
Let's do it.
I'm ready.
Let's dive into those other influences next. We'll see how podcasting incorporates elements of, like, literature, theater, even visual media.
Okay, I'm excited to hear about that. That sounds fascinating.
Yeah, it's really cool to see how all these different pieces fit together to create this vibrant medium we know as podcasting.
Well, let's take a quick break and we'll come right back to explore those other influences on podcasting.
Sounds good.
So before the break, you were telling me that podcasting gets inspiration from all kinds of media, not just radio.
Exactly. It's this really fascinating blend.
Okay, so what are we talking about here? What other media are in the mix?
Well, the author mentions a bunch like literature, theater, performing arts,
Oh,
visual media, design, even internet participatory culture like blogs.
wow. That's a lot of different influences.
It is, and they all kind of come together in this unique way to shape what podcasting is.
That's so cool. Can you give me like some concrete examples of how these influences show up in podcasting?
Sure, let's start with literature, for example.
Okay.
Think about how podcasters craft their scripts, right?
Yeah.
They're using all sorts of literary techniques, like classic storytelling structures, character development, things like that.
So are you saying it's not just about like adapting old radio scripts?
No, not at all. It's about using those literary tools to create something new and engaging.
So like drawing inspiration from the world of literature and applying it to this audio format.
Exactly. And then you have the theatrical influence as well.
Oh yeah, that's a good point.
Pay attention to how a podcast host delivers their lines, you know?
Yeah.
The vocal inflections, the pacing, the pauses it all borrows from the art of performance.
Oh, totally. It's like they're putting on a show, even though it's just audio.
Right. Like podcasting has become this form of audio theater in a way.
It's bringing those elements of live performance to our ears, even if we're not physically in a theater.
Exactly. And speaking of live performance,
Yep.
have you ever been to a live podcast show?
Actually, yeah, I have. I saw one of my favorite podcasts do a live recording a few months ago.
Oh, cool. What did you think?
It was amazing. It was so cool to see them like bring the show to life on stage.
Yeah, it adds a whole other dimension to it, doesn't it?
Totally.
The author actually mentions This American Life and The Moth as examples of podcasts that have really mastered this live show format.
Oh, yeah, those are great examples. I love those shows.
They're great at blending storytelling with theatrical elements and audience interaction.
Yeah, they really know how to work a crowd.
Right, so we see how podcasting is not just confined to our headphones anymore.
Yeah, it's breaking free.
It's blurring the lines between different art forms that I think is really exciting.
Me too. It's so dynamic. Okay, so we talked about literature, theater. What else is there?
Oh, we can't forget the visual side of things. I mean, podcasts aren't just audio files anymore, right? They
Right.
have visual identities like logos, cover art, websites, social media presence.
Oh, yeah, that's true. You're totally right.
And that visual branding can really make a difference.
Totally. Like when you're scrolling through like Apple Podcasts or Spotify, you see all these cool cover art designs, and it kind of gives you a sense of what the show's about.
Exactly. It's like a first impression.
Yeah, it's like the book cover for your ears.
I like that. The book cover for your ear.
Okay, so visual media, check. What about design?
Well, design plays a huge role in like the user experience of podcasting apps.
Good.
How easy it is to find podcasts, to subscribe, to listen to them.
Oh, yeah, that makes sense.
Good design makes all the difference.
Totally. And what about that internet culture piece you mentioned, the blogs and all that?
Right. So think back to the early days of blogging, you know.
Yeah.
People were sharing their thoughts and experiences in this really personal and direct way.
Yeah, it was all about like connecting with your readers and building a community.
Exactly. And I think that same spirit has carried over to podcasting in a lot of ways.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So like the way podcast hosts often address their listeners directly, it's kind of like they're blogging out loud.
Yeah, there's definitely that sense of intimacy and connection.
It's like podcasts are the audio equivalent of blogs, you
I
know,
love that. The audio equivalent of blogs.
creating these spaces for intimate conversations or
Yeah.
niche interests. It's really cool.
It is. And what's so fascinating is that, you know, this hybrid nature of podcasting, this fusion of all these influences, it's not static.
Right, it's always changing.
Exactly. It keeps evolving.
So how does the author account for this constant evolution?
Well, they use this term socio-technical assemblage.
Sociotechnical assemblage. Okay, that sounds complicated.
It sounds fancy, but it basically means that podcasting is shaped by this interplay of human factors, like the producers, the listeners,
Okay.
and non-human factors, like the technology, the platforms.
So it's not just about the content of the podcast themselves.
Right.
It's about this whole ecosystem.
Exactly. It's this network of interconnected things that are all influencing each other.
So it's like a constantly shifting landscape, right?
Yeah,
Influenced by power dynamics, relationships between all these different players.
precisely. And I think, understanding that complexity helps us appreciate podcasting's unique place in the media landscape.
Yeah, it definitely does. Okay, so I'm starting to the bigger picture here. Podcasting is this super complex, dynamic form that's constantly reshaping itself.
And that's what makes it so fascinating.
It really does. This deep dive has been so eye-opening.
I'm glad to hear that.
I feel like I'm looking at podcasting in a whole new light.
That's what's so great about exploring these topics, right?
It really is. It challenges our assumptions and helps us appreciate the nuances of something we might take for granted.
Exactly. And I think with podcasting especially, there are so many layers to uncover.
Absolutely. So after this journey through the evolution of podcasting, what's the main takeaway for someone like me, or anyone really, who's exploring the world of podcasts?
I think the biggest takeaway is that podcasting is so much more than just radio on demand.
Yeah, it's so much more than that.
It's this vibrant, evolving medium that draws inspiration from all these different sources, and its story is still being written.
That's such a good point. It feels like we're at this crucial juncture in podcasting's history
I agree.
where
Yeah.
things could go in a lot of different directions.
Exactly. And as listeners, we have a role to play in shaping that future.
Oh, how so?
The choices we make about where we listen, who we support, those things matter.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more.
We'll pick up right after this quick break. So we were talking about the choices we make as listeners.
Yeah, how those choices can actually shape the future of podcasting.
Right, exactly.
So, what are some things we should be thinking about?
Well, we talked about how these big companies are getting more and more involved in podcasting.
Yeah.
And that's definitely something to keep an eye on.
Right.
Will they support a diverse range of voices?
Yeah.
Or will they just prioritize the shows that are going to make them the most money?
That's a really good point. And it makes me think about those independent creators that we were talking about earlier.
Right.
How can we, as listeners, help ensure that their voices aren't lost?
That's such a crucial question.
Yeah.
And honestly, I think one of the most powerful things we can do is to actively choose to support them.
How do we do that?
Well, for one thing, we can be mindful of the platforms we're using to listen to podcasts.
Right.
Are we primarily using platforms that are owned by huge corporations?
Right.
Or are we seeking out platforms that are specifically designed to support independent creators?
Oh, so it's we're voting with our ears.
Exactly. Every time we listen to a podcast, we're kind of casting a vote for the kind of podcasting landscape we want to see.
I like that. So we need to be conscious consumers.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, what else can we do?
Well, never underestimate the power of word of mouth.
Oh, yeah. Tell me about it.
If you find a podcast that you love, especially if it's from a lesser-known creator, tell your friends about it.
Right.
Share it on social media.
Yeah.
Leave a review.
Yeah.
All of those things can really make a difference.
It's we can all be podcasting ambassadors, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Spreading the word about these shows that deserve a bigger audience.
I love that. So it's about being active listeners, being engaged with the podcasting community, and using our voices to support the creators that we love.
Exactly. And ultimately, it's about staying curious.
Yeah.
Exploring, keeping your ears open for new voices and new perspectives.
Right. Because who knows what amazing discoveries are out there just
Yeah.
waiting to be found.
Precisely. The world of podcasting is constantly expanding. There's always something new and exciting to discover.
Well, this has been such an incredible journey. We've really gone deep into the world of podcasting today.
We have.
We've uncovered its origins, explored how it's connected to other forms of media, and even looked ahead to what the future might hold.
And I think the main takeaway for me is that podcasting is way more complex and nuanced than it might seem at first glance.
I agree.
It's this dynamic, evolving medium that really reflects our changing media landscape.
Yeah, it really does. And it's been so fascinating to explore that with you today.
Likewise, it's always a pleasure to chat about podcasting.
And to our listeners, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of podcasting. We hope you've enjoyed it.
Keep exploring, keep listening, and most importantly, keep those earbuds charged.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Until next time.